So, good afternoon, everybody. As Marcus already said, I'm Harrie. I work as a software engineer at iBuildings in the Netherlands. I've done so for 8 years, so quite a while by now. And I'm here today to talk to you about code smells. But before I do, I'd like to ask you a question. Who of you guys likes watching Discovery Channel? A lot of us, right? I mean, we're geeks. We like this kind of stuff. We don't care about stars dancing on the ice of those talent shows or stupid things. We want, like, the sciencey stuff. So we want to know how the universe works or how toothpicks are made or whatever. And so I was watching Discovery Channel the other day, and they were moving this really big industrial pipe around. It was a 100-ton pipe, and they used one of those to transport it, right? You might have seen one on television once. They come with remote controls, and you can like steer them within an inch, and it's all really cool. And so everything went fine, and they were 10 meters from their target, 30 feet, no, whatever. They were almost there, and then there was a problem. 2 of the wheels had lost air pressure. So yeah, big deal. We still have like 1 million left. You know, let's just continue, most people thought. And actually, they were planning to. But there was one guy saying no. It was an American guy, so let's assume his name was Bob. And Bob says, no, we can't continue. We have to stop here because... But they were like, come on, Bob, it's just 2 wheels. We can't just continue the last couple of meters and then we'll be there. He said, no, we have to work in the weekend, reinflate those tires. I mean, it's not like changing your car. It's quite a big deal. They had to work in the weekend, and it was horrible. So, but Bob still insisted, it had to be done. Now, how would you feel about Bob if he was in your team? Yeah, probably. Or an asshole, maybe, for making you work in the weekend. But he especially is, he really is an expert, probably. He knows what can go wrong if you continue going with 2 wheels that aren't inflated, probably. And I thought those minor tells really apply in PHP software development as well, right? I mean, when you're writing code, there can also be really small things that can indicate really big problems. In our case, not our pipe will fall over from the truck. In our case, our code will become unmaintainable, or we can't reuse it anymore, or we can't test it. And those things are also expensive. So over the years, from growing from a junior developer to a rather senior developer at iBuildings, I noticed that a lot of those code smells actually helped me to grow. I went to conference and I heard about dependency injection, and I heard about all kinds of code patterns that you should use. But then when I went back to coding, I was just typing along like I always did, and I didn't really know when to start using them. And by watching out for these code smells, they were actually triggers to make me think, am I still doing the right thing? And so I decided to make a list of those code smells, the ones that helped me the best over the years, and show them to you. They helped me a lot, and hopefully they will help you as well to write better maintainable code. So I divide them in categories, and the first category has to do with methods, functions. And according to Wikipedia, of course the most reliable source on the internet, methods should do a specific task, and I agree there, a specific task, so not 6 specific tasks, it should do 1 specific task, really good. And I always think that when you can split up a method, you should. They should be as small as possible. And why? I'm going to show you. I'm going to do a little test. I'm going to show you a piece of code for 3 seconds, and after that I will ask you, what does this code do? The font is a bit small, so in the back you guys probably don't have a chance. But in the front you probably will. So here we go, 3 seconds. So, anyone has a clue? It sends emails, yeah, right. Let's do something else? I was hoping. Yeah, sure. So it does stuff. It says exactly something with emails. It does some parsing in there. Yeah, probably multiple times indeed. So I refactored this method because of some code smells that I saw. And now it actually looks like this. 3 seconds again. We're going to watch again, right? Hey, it gets addresses and it sends out emails. It's really easy to see, right? It's just, and that's how I like my methods to be. I just want it to be small pieces of code that I can just understand by looking at them. And so I like to split up. if we look at the original code, there are a couple of things wrong with it, and especially the number of levels of nesting is something to always keep in mind. We see a if statement here, then a for each there, then an if there, then a for each there, then an if. I know you can't read it in the back, but you will see the sort of Christmas tree looking thingy. That's not how it's supposed to look. The problem with this, especially, is when you're reading it, it's really hard to remember what the context is of where you're in. So you're in an if statement, so you have to remember that, okay, I'm only going into this code if this is true. Then I'm going to loop through a certain array. So I have to, okay, so here I am in a loop, but only if that's true. Then here's another if, so okay, if that's true, then as well. And by the time I'm here, I have no idea what all the conditions were, etc., that apply to my current situation. So typically, this is something I'd like to rewrite. One of the easiest things we can do here, we get the database, we do a database query and we put it in an array. We can put it in a separate function. So now it's already a bit better, and this getReceiverAddresses method will actually become quite in handy, maybe later on as well. Maybe in some other piece of the code, we will also want to see which people are receiving emails. Now we have just one function that gets them for us. So it's an improvement. Now the following thing we can improve, and I see these a lot in production code, and I always think they're really stupid, is if statements that cover your entire method. I don't know if you've ever seen them. It says here, if there are any addresses, we're going to do this. So basically what we're saying is, if we haven't got any addresses, we don't care. I mean, and that's really how it works. That's also, if I'm going to read this later on, or in the future I'm going to read my own method, then I'm easily going to see, okay, so we're going to do something, but if we haven't any addresses, I'm no longer interested, you know, we're just going to bail out. Easier to maintain, easy to remember. Now you get my drift, you can repeat this and keep doing it. The inside of this for each you can move to a separate method, and there we are almost at the point where we were with the other example slide. Of course it could be optimized further for in this send email methods was again lots going on, you can split up that as well. But it's really helpful to keep those methods small and split them up when you can. I'm trying to be, I know there are some really strict rules in some companies about it, about how many levels of nesting you should apply. I tend to apply the rule that in this for each, I might have another if statement, but only if it's like one line of code, you know, so if this isn't true, we continue, something like that, that's okay. If I'm going to write an if statement in here, or a case switch statement, or another loop, or whatever, that's really large, then I like to put that in a separate method, just for readability's sake. I mean, then it's just a separate method. I can understand it again, what it's doing. Again, you have to figure out for yourself what happens the best, you know. Maybe for you, you like to apply some other standards. But keep in mind that nesting certain things in each other is a code smell, and you should be thinking when you're doing it, am I actually doing the right thing, or should I maybe split this up? Now another thing, and this slide isn't even intended to be read, is long methods. This is actually a method from an open source project that I found. Part of the method, I have to say. I simply decreased the font size to 5 and put it on one slide. So this is the screenshot of it. You can still see the bars from my IDE. This is really like a 400-line method or something like that. Now the problem we have here is, again, context. If I'm here, I don't know in what context I don't remember what happened there or even above that. And what I haven't covered yet, but also applies here, is testability. I mean, imagine I want to write a unit test that tests if this if statement here is doing the right thing. It's going to be hard. I'm going to have to set all the test conditions so it boils all the way down through the code. It gets eventually here, and then it will do something, and I can maybe test if it works, but it's really a pain in the ass to do. I actually saw such a method once in an open source library I was using to generate PDF files. And it had a method to draw a table of contents. So you could simply say, draw the table of contents on page 2 of my PDF, and it would do so, great. But it wrote all the numbers in the table of contents bold. For some reason, I don't know, I just wanted to have regular font, so I thought, well, I need to fix that. So I found out that in the library they had a method of hundreds of lines that was called draw table of contents, and it would draw the table of contents. And somewhere, let's say here, it said set font style B. That meant, okay, the letters are going to be printed bold. So in order to fix this, I mean, I'm not going to hack into this open source library because next time I can't update it anymore. So I extended it into a child class. I copied the entire hundreds lines of method, and I actually removed the B, and that fixed my problem. You can see what the problem there is, right? So maintainability, reusability, and testability is an issue when you have really long methods. Again, you have to see what works for yourself. Personally, when I'm typing a method and I get around 10 lines of code, I really start wondering, hey, wait, can't I draw this any differently? Shouldn't I maybe be splitting this up? If I get to 15 lines or even 20, then I'm really starting to get worried. I'm starting to search, well, there has to be a way how I can split this up in a way that it still makes sense. Again, maybe longer methods work for you. You have to find your own standards, but at least pay attention to it, and it should be a trigger. Hey, so many lines, I need to do something, maybe. Another smell that tells that your method could be split up, and you might not think of this as a code smell in the beginning, is inline comments. Inline comments in methods, I'm not talking about descriptive methods, descriptive comments that actually tell you what's going on. If you have a complex regular expression and you want to document it by some comment saying this is doing that and whatever, perfect, you know, that's great, of course. But if often you see in these methods that actually the inline comments separate your method into several pieces. So it will say, here we're going to do this. Then 5 lines further it says, now we've done that, we're going to do this. Finally, we're going to loop through the results and blah, 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 you know. Inline comments often say such things in methods. And actually they're all saying, okay, this part of the method is doing this part is doing that, so we can already split it up, right? I know it's a bit of a stupid example, I couldn't think of anything in real life. So here we're creating a fish and here we're letting it swim. So we could have 2 methods. Create fish, let it swim. And now we have to separate it again. It's easier to read. We just see, okay, this thing creates new fishes, the other lets fishes swim. Easy to maintain. We can override one of those methods if we wanted to make swim differently, whatever. So inline comments, again, can be a tell that you should split up your method. Note that the comments that you used here, you can actually reuse in the header of your method, right? So you can now just say, instead of we're going to do this, you put that in your method. This method does X. Now, when it comes to functions, there are a couple of others I want to go over quickly. An uncommunicative name is also one. So public function Go is probably not the best name for your method. It should be descriptive. Run is also not really helpful most of the times. And it should not be too long. I mean, if it's too long, then you just keep reading all the time. Imagine that somebody else is going to use your object, so he's going to type the object name, then type an arrow sign behind it, and your IDE will probably show a list with methods that you can use. Make sure that these methods make sense, and I'm not going to read all the doc-block documentation at that point. I'm just going to look for the method that makes my fish swim, I don't know. So make sure they are communicative, that people who see the function immediately know, okay, this method is probably doing that. And then if they're not sure, they can still read the comments and decide if it's really what they want. And finally, for methods, a method can have too many input parameters. So if your method takes like 20 input parameters, chances are that there's something wrong. What often happens in that case is that actually a bunch of those parameters should be bundled. They're all part of the same thing that they're describing. So maybe you should actually have an object there with some properties, and you should be passing the object around rather than all the separate parameters. Doesn't have to be, it depends on the situation. But remember, if you're typing code and your method has like really a lot of parameters, you should start thinking, wait, isn't there a better way how I can do this? Is this really the way I want to go? So there we are, the code smells for methods. A glass of water for a moment. Yeah. So watch out for the levels of nesting for too long methods. Inline comments can indicate that you should split it up. Also an uncommunicative name. And it can have too many parameters. Now, of course, we can also have code smells on an object level. So if we're looking at objects, oh, it's really dark here. Well, no problem, you can see still my vacuum cleaner and my elephant and my, I don't know the English word for that, my tennis racket. What's it called? Watering can, yes. It's a gieter in Dutch. So. Wikipedia, again, says it should present a noun, and that's the thing I think is important. It should be a noun, so it should be an object or a place or a person. Well, in this case, it can be a possibly quite abstract thing. I think that exactly captures how it should be named. And I like to think, when I think about classes, as that they have certain responsibilities. This class is responsible for this. It doesn't know anything else in the world. It doesn't care about anything else in the world. It knows about this. It deals with this problem. One of the things you often see go wrong with objects and classes is that they have too many methods, and it's called the God object smell. This is an example from a framework we created many years ago called ATK. It isn't really developed anymore at the moment, so I won't use it. But 10 years ago, it was a great idea, right? We had a node you could extend from, and it would describe your database table. So you would say, I have a node person. And then you could add attributes to it. So you could say, I have a normal attribute for last name, a normal attribute for first name. I have a date attribute being his birthday. And then you could just say to the node, show the edit form, and it would loop through all the attributes to show the edit form. And again, for saving, every attribute was responsible for saving itself into the database, etc. Back at the time, that looked like a great idea. The problem was that this object became really large because it was responsible for doing everything. There was code in there to display the add form, the edit form. There was code in there to store the actual form. There was code in there to display a data grid and to navigate through it using pagination, searching. So this grew out to be an object of like 4,000 lines and became really unmaintainable. So what we then started doing is splitting it up so that we actually had an edit form renderer and that we would have a database table object that was responsible for communicating with the database. We have a data grid object that draws data grids. And again, the paginator might be a separate object that you can use somewhere else. Now the advantage of not having everything in this node class is that you can actually reuse these things. If you make them abstract enough, you can simply pick this paginator to another project or maybe to where they aren't even using the same framework. And you can simply use the logic that you made there and reuse it. Of course, there are other ways to do this. We'll come to that later on. But having too many methods in your class is really a smell, and you should really be aware, isn't there some code in here that really should be a separate object that I can use separately, and that might improve reusability and maintainability, of course. So that's one, it can have too many methods. Something else to look out for is whenever you type new. This might be a surprise, it looks really harmless. I mean, and we type it every day, right, to create new objects, blah, blah, is new, whatever. But what you're actually doing when you're typing new is you're tightly coupling two objects together. So in this case, I have a class speaker. And here I create a new tag with a tag title. From now on, speaker and tag are, like, as they like to say, tightly coupled. They can't be separated anymore. So every time I create a speaker, it will create a tag for me, and I have nothing to say about that. Now imagine if I want to test this, and I want to present it with a mock speaker object, mock tag object, because I don't want to test the tag object, I just want to test the speaker object. That's a problem, because it's hard-coded in there, I can change it. Also, if maybe later on we will have a object called tutorial for some reason, and I want to assign a tutorial to a speaker, now I have a problem because I can't anymore. Those things are tightly coupled and can be separated. So that's the problem. The solution for this is called dependency injection. You might have heard for it. It's pretty popular lately. And one of the simplest ways to do that is to use constructor injection. In that case, you will simply pass the tag in the constructor and set it. And already, this is an improvement. It isn't ideal. It's like there's still some flaws here. But it's already an improvement, right? Now we can also have a tutorial class extend from the tag class and pass that into there. And that will also work. So it's not as tightly coupled as it wasn't anymore. Note that in this case, it's still required to supply a tag when you're creating a speaker. So if you don't want that, you can use setter injection. And in that case, you will have a separate setter where you can set the tag. Now it's optional, so you can create a speaker, and if you want, you can add a tag to it. It really depends on what you want, if you want it to be required or not. It's kind of what your thing is. Using dependency injection is a good idea, and as I said, a lot of people are moving there. However, this code, again, might have some other issues with it. Imagine now every time we create a speaker, we have to first create a tag, then create the speaker object, and then assign the tag object to the speaker object. So that's 3 lines of code. Now, if I'm having more complex objects and I'm with more relations, this gets bigger. So every time I'm creating an object, I'm typing like 20 lines of code to just create a tag or something, right? So you can fix that by using dependency injection containers, which could look something like this. Just a separate method where I say it, create speaker with tag. From now on, I can call that method, and it will automatically get the dependencies and assign them to each other. New trend is, and you will see that in Zen Framework 2 and in Lithium and in Symfony, I think. All those frameworks are moving to dependency injection containers where you can actually configure this. So you can just have a configuration file saying, okay, a speaker can have a tag, and the tag take this as a constructor parameter, etc. And then you can just ask the dependency injection container, okay, now give me a speaker, and it will give you a speaker. And so really there isn't any new keywords in your code anymore. Now what you use, I mean, you're all smart people, and you can all figure out how dependency injection works and how to get this working, etc. But typing the new keyword is really a signal that you maybe should. So every time when you type new to create an object, think, is this really what I want? Do I really want to tightly couple these things together? Every time now I get here, it will automatically create an object. Shouldn't I be doing this differently? Maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't. That is a decision you have to make. But when you're typing new, it is a real code smell, and you should pay attention to it. So there's 2. Is there any more? Sure. Who can guess what inappropriate intimacy is? Yes, it's objects who are accessing each other's internals too much. So you can imagine 2 objects that an object really should only know so much about itself. I mean, the other thing is indecent exposure, and that's actually quite the opposite. So if you have an object that does indecent exposure, it actually has public methods, for example, that shouldn't be public, that really should be private and only in its own context. Now this can be abused by using the one above, by another object, and it will actually start manipulating the object in a way it shouldn't even be supposed to know. If we saw the vacuum cleaner in the beginning, it has an on button and an off button. Those are public, right? I mean, it's like public methods that we can use to turn it off and on. I don't want a button turn the engine of the vacuum cleaner on or something. Or maybe that's all it does. Well, anyway, I don't want to manipulate the internals of the vacuum cleaner. I just want to turn it off and on, and that's it. So you should really be aware of which methods you make public and which not, and what objects should know about each other. So that's something to take in mind. Finally, for objects at least, there's the primitive obsession. And for PHP, this typically always means that you're using arrays, where you would be better off using objects. You can imagine when you have an array with people data, so you have a lot of people, first name, last name, date of birth, whatever, and you have an array with arrays with this data in it, it might be a good idea to actually create a person object and use that instead. Now you certainly know which fields are possible to set. It will have proper getters and setters, and if you make a typo and say last name without the final E or something, it will throw an error, so we will know, hey, something's wrong, instead of simply array key doesn't exist and the last name for some reason never shows up. So that's something else to take in mind. So objects can have too many methods. Watch out for when you're typing new, because you're tightly copying them. Beware of the relation with other objects. So really keep in mind, what should this object know? Should it really be aware of the existence of the other object? And what should it know about the other object? Probably not too much. The less, the better. And beware if you're using a lot of arrays to transfer data around, etc. Ask yourself, shouldn't I be using objects instead to do this? Now, finally, we have some general code smells, which you can all probably guess already. The one I really like is duplicated code. Whenever you copy some code, you should really ask yourself, am I doing the right thing? I mean, I really like this example from a real-life case. This is actually not really what I mean, but this guy obviously copied like the top number of lines from one controller to the other and then changed the class names and forgot to update the... so I got him. But what I'm really talking about is really copying logic. So when you're really copying the internals of a method to another method, or maybe even to another class or whatever, you should really think, wait a minute, shouldn't those two objects maybe be both child objects of the same super object that has this method in it? Again, it depends on the situation and you have to look out for it, but basically whenever you type Control-C or Command-C for the Apple users, you should really start asking, wait a minute, should I really be copying this code? Isn't there a better way to solve this problem? Type embedded in a name. I've never in real life experienced this one, but I saw it when I was researching the subject. I thought, well, actually, that sounds like a good idea. I mean, if you're calling your variable person array and your method get person array, that's great up until a certain point, until you discovered, well, I went to a talk from some guy named Harrie, and he said that I shouldn't use arrays for persons, but I should have person objects. So get person array starts returning person objects instead of arrays. Now I have a huge problem. Now everywhere where I get these results, I have to go and change the variable name from person array to person object then or something. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Actually, I think in this case there are two scenarios. The first being the unlikely one. That's that the person is going through his entire code base and string replace all the person array with person object. The second option, which is I think the more probable one, is that it will simply keep this name and it will say person array, but it secretly will be an object. So try avoid that if you can. There's no need for it to put type names in there. We have for objects and arrays, we have the code hinting. For the other values, I often don't really care that much, and then still you can cast them and test them, and etc. So that's fine. And it can be really annoying to fix them all, and there's no need for it, so don't do it. Having this all said, you should be aware of speculative generality, which is a hard word to pronounce, and it basically says that you shouldn't start generalizing objects until you really have to. So if you have an employee class in your code, don't start off by making that a child class of a person class while all you have is really the employee class. That would make it just unneededly complex. It would just be like adding extra complexity where it isn't needed. And you can still easily fix that later on if you decide that you have another object that should share some logic with the employee class. So be aware of that, of the, yeah. So, to sum things up, here's the entire list of things I like to be aware of, and as simple as they may seem, those really help me over time to become a better developer. I mean, junior developers don't care about this. When I started off as a developer and I saw a 200-line method, I would just add 200 more to it, right? And yeah, no big deal. When you're getting a bit further, you might recognizing, and yeah, maybe this method should be rewritten because it's getting really long, but yeah, probably this case it will be all right here. And then there's Bob. And Bob will say, no, this isn't right. We need to fix this first. This method is too long. These objects are tightly coupled. We shouldn't. These wheels aren't inflated anymore properly. So if you don't fix them, your pipe will fall off your truck, and you don't want that. Thank you. Now, I finished way early, so we have like 15.
Plenty of time for,
15
plenty of
minutes
time for questions.
A good friend of mine codes really badly, and I'd like to give him some tips from your talk.
Yeah.
Have you got any tips on how he should refactor his code?
Well, basically, when it comes to refactor, did everybody get the question since the first part was missing? He has a friend that codes really badly, and he asks if I have any tips to how he can refactor his methods. The methods, right? Especially like if you use really long methods. I'd say almost all the time when you are creating a loop, the contents of the loop can go to a separate method. Most of the time. I'm not saying always, but 9 out of 10 times you can like write that into a separate method. And again, the inside of if statements, same thing. They probably can go to other method as well. So, yeah, if I would have to give any advice on refactoring methods, I would just say, well, see if you can just pick the entire thing that's within the if statement into a separate method, into a way that still makes sense. And that basically applies to all the control structures, so for each is for's, if statements, etc. Does that help? Yeah. Okay.
How do you manage in iBuilding code review when you find that peer developers use a kind of code that could smell? How do you, what's the most effective way that you use in iBuilding to communicate and still have a
yeah, so I was kind of expecting this question. Of course, there are tools like the code sniffer and PHP mess detector, which we use in our CI environment. So you see the, especially the progress, So you see first of all, the mess detector indicates, well, that's a certain number, and then you see the number increasing suddenly after a commit. Then you know, oh, probably somebody has screwing things up, They probably have too much logic within one method or whatever. I haven't included in this talk particularly because I really want to talk about writing better code rather than, and I think those tools are really helpful, but especially when you're working in a team and to check it afterwards. So we do have it in our CI environment and we do check it every once in a while. To be honest, we don't go there after every commit and see what's going on, So it's just every once in a while we check it, and if there's some really bizarre numbers there, then we will like drill down to it and see what's going wrong and if it can be improved.
So it's mainly automatic, it's not by you?
No, exactly. So it's mainly automatic, yeah. So these code smells that I just showed you are really for yourself while you're coding, things you should be looking out for, okay, here's something going wrong. Probably you should start thinking and maybe do differently. And the automated tests in your CI environment are just the automated tests that really just return metrics. They probably won't recognize all the code smells that I showed you today, but things like the number of lines in a method or the numbers of nesting within a method, so the complexity of your method, those can be calculated and those can be really good helpful tools to monitor your team and see if everything's still going the right way.
Hi, hello. So 2 questions. First, how do we know that Bob was right? They didn't try to actually push forward for another 10 meters, so we don't know if he was right or wrong.
No, we don't know, but oh, did anyone get this question? The question was, how do we know that Bob was right? I mean, maybe we should have just moved the truck like 10 meters further and nothing would have happened. And of course, that's the case, but I mean, Bob doesn't like to just tease his friends by saying you have to work in the weekend. He honestly believes that there's something going wrong there, so he really thinks we should fix this, and maybe he has seen it going wrong somewhere else already, or maybe he has read about it or has seen a presentation on it. But he knows what the consequences are when the wheels aren't inflated. I'm not sure if this metaphor will keep up anymore.
Could I just ask the audience, can you put your hand up if you would employ Bob? I think that kind of sells it.
And the second question I've got is, did anybody measure the loss of performance when you redo the refactoring, or do you actually try to remove the code smell?
I think that's a good question. So he asked, did you actually remeasure the performance loss after you refactored your code? And to be honest, for me personally, I'd say that for me the performance in this case is just less important than the readability of the code. So, I mean, if you're going to optimize on that level, those are really micro optimizations for whether or not to keep everything in one method or spend an expensive method call that takes no time at all, really. So no, in this case, I personally would always go for readability and reusability of the code, etc. And then if it's getting slower, you might add hardware, you might add caching. That's a different problem you can solve in different ways, but I wouldn't prefer solving that by writing 500-line methods. Any more questions? In the back?
With regards to the amount of code lines that you have in a particular method, is there a particular number that you're more comfortable with, or do you regard it as just common sense? So if it runs over to 15 lines and it still gets a specific task done and it makes more sense with regards to readability, it's just a common sense call as when you're doing it, or is there a specific number you try to stick to?
Yeah, so for me personally, it's just common sense, really. Yeah, it also depends. When I'm working in a model, for example, of really coding on business logic, I'm a bit more critical about that. Then I really want it to be readable, etc. But for example, in controllers, in controller actions, then you often have, it's just boilerplate code. We're going to fetch some objects there, we're going to fetch some object there, we're going to make it do that, and then assigning to the view. Yeah, of course, it all still makes sense, and there isn't really, it doesn't make a lot of sense to actually split that up into multiple parts. So, for me personally, like I said, the 10-line or 50-line limit, I try to apply. Somewhere in that area, I'm starting to get really worried and split it up. But it can depend. And maybe in a controller, when it's still good, readable, etc., I'm like, yeah, well, okay, that's good. I think the most important thing I wanted to show in the talk is that at least it should make you think. And then whether you decide, well, this is still just perfectly readable and there's no problem with it and I'm going to keep it this way, or, well, there is a problem with it and I'm going to split this up. That's really up to you, of course, what you do with that.
Yeah, I think that's the main trouble, really, is that if it can get out of hand. I mean, the flip side of it is that you could have so many methods that people are trying to read it, and by the time you start off and you're trying to work out, what this particular bit of functionality does, and you end up going down so many avenues that you forget where you even started. Because obviously, if you just do it too much to the extreme, and also the amount of time that you're going to spend on doing this, if it's just for the sake of just refactoring 20 lines of code. It's I don't know. I don't think it'd be worth it. But then I guess it's a common sense call.
Exactly.
When you're doing it.
It should really just trigger your common sense, but you still have to keep thinking yourself how it should work. And but exactly. So it are triggers. It should trigger you into thinking, but then still you should just use your own common sense to see how you solve it, if you solve it.
So, with regards to the naming convention, do you have any tips how we should name the functions? Because I noticed that, for example, some IDEs, they display functions in alphabetic order. So if you start your function that relates to another function, or maybe extend something else, you could start with the same keyword. And that's therefore you will see it in the IDE coming next.
To be honest, you mean like if I have any tips on how you should name your methods?
Yeah, how you should name the functions that make sense. Because, for example, if you work in a multinational team, they all seem to name the functions in a different ways and different conventions. Do you have any tips on how to do it? Because it might be that
no, actually I don't. I still just use common sense, and if I'm getting a person object, I would call it getPerson most of the time, and
yeah, for example, if you think you've got edit action, and then there's edit process action, and well, people seem to name it different ways, and some it's like process edit rather than edit process. And in the IDE, if you use your code, you can see it straight away, where if your IDE is set up for that, so you can find the next function that's coming after.
Okay, so that's more of the order you put the functions in.
Yeah, there's any kind of.
So personally, what I do, if I have multiple methods that are calling each other, I would just organize them in the file underneath each other rather than ordering them alphabetically. I don't really see a use for that anyway, but I would just say if you have multiple methods, I would still just give them names really descriptive of what they're doing. So this method is doing X, this method is doing Z. And then if they are all really related to each other, I just put them in the same file underneath each other. So when I'm reading, I can just see, oh, it's calling that and that file, that's that underneath there, right? So I just put all my methods in the same part of the class. So, hi.
Yes, hi. I was thinking about, well, regarding code refactoring and so on. Could you tell us a bit about your approach to unit testing and if there's any specific software you use to, well, make sure you've got code coverage properly and so on? Yeah, so we use PHP unit to do unit testing. And again, we integrate in our CI environment to run the unit tests. And that's something, I think you need to download something before it starts working, but you can have PHP unit just generate these code coverage files and then the CI environment reads them again and displays them. So in this way you always have like this metric in your CI environment for this amount of code it has been unit tested. And you can click through it and see in each method, each class, which lines are actually touched by the unit tests and which ones aren't. So. Does it answer your question, or? Yeah, I wondered what you're using and if you're happy with it. So yeah, PHP unit, and yeah, I'm happy with it. Works great. Yeah. Hi.
How do you handle object programming spaghetti? Meaning when the objects are organized on such a convoluted way that you end up with object programming too many levels of.
Yeah, exactly. So that's something that I also read on Twitter a while ago. I mean, we all know the term spaghetti code, you know, when you have like, that's a name for these really a lot of if statements and for eaches, etc. And then I read about lasagna code, which would basically just a lot of layers on top of each other, so you can't figure out anymore what's going on. Personally, I've never seen it, but I think if you apply the right coding patterns and if you're just really keep using your common sense, that won't happen, you know. But again, that's probably the general thingy that was on there. Don't overdo it. So don't start making generalized objects when there really isn't any need for it. So
okay, well, there's people queuing outside, so I think we have to.
I think we have to round up.
Yeah. First, two things. First, I want to say thanks to Harrie, and I get a very little chance to do a poll of PHP developers. So first of all, thank you to Harrie for doing it. Thank you.